Hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed a nice long weekend. Thank you for watching. We are going to be talking about Greek art and ancient Greek pottery, and then we are going to dive into the very, very important lesson that is working with clay. If you need to pick up your clay, make sure you do that on time. If it is out too long in the warm kind of temperature, it can harden and that makes it a lot harder for your project. So here is our presentation, and then in the next video, you're going to see a step-by-step clay or day-by-day clay and how we are going to get this done Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And hopefully on Thursday when we check in together live, you will have a lot of your project done. So let's get started talking about our ancient Greek art. Okay, so mostly we're talking about pottery, we're talking about ancient Greek. There are a lot of other really exciting classical works of art, with the statues and marble, things like that. But what we're focusing on is the Greek art of pottery. So this is where we are. Again, Greece was looking a little different than it is today, but not too different. And we have Macedonia and all that, Crete, all those places. And we are kind of all throughout here because even though it's spread out, they're still sharing a lot of their culture and their art. Some of the questions I want you guys thinking about while we're going through this is, why is Greek pottery significant? Who made them? What stories do they tell about ancient Greek life? What were these vessels used for? How were they made? And what do we use pottery for today? How is that different? So here are just some examples of Athenian pottery. And again, it's not, we're not seeing too much space except the positive and negative. They're doing a lot of understanding in that, as far as the background is the dark color, and then they're going in with that same dark color and adding details. They didn't have a bunch of different color glazes or underglazes, so they did what they could and still were very detailed with their works. Okay. The significance of pottery, and again, here we see the positive, negative differences. It became a very valuable tool to study history, history through Greek cultures, through their paintings, structures and sculptures. As far as this goes, the structures and paintings did not survive as well as the Greek pottery, which is why so much of this is what we study when we are looking at ancient Greece. All right, and here we see a depiction of how this process went. It was an actual job to create the pottery, and then you had a second person on your team, and they would do the decorating of the pottery, and then you'd have someone else who was working the kiln. And it was just a lot of, it was kind of like a manufacturing job. So we make the pottery, we paint the pottery, we fire the pottery, we sell the pottery. This is something that's really, really important, and I hope you guys kind of are able to tell the difference. These are the 3 pottery techniques as far as decoration goes. You have black figure, which we can see right here. It's pretty easily explainable and easy to understand. We have the white ground, which is not the same as these, and instead we're adding a little bit of white underglaze to our clay. If you are using white air dry clay or white clay, this is what you're probably going to want to be inspired by, okay, as far as color schemes go. And then we have red figure, where you paint or underglaze the entire vessel, and then you carve the underglaze off on the parts that you want the design to be. And then again, you've got some details on there as well. So black figure, that's where your positive space is black. Red figure, that's where your negative space is black. And white ground, where you're adding white in there, and it's not just that terracotta color, okay? I will say that when you're using the red clay, all right, which is like this color, it's almost brown and rusty, but, and we'll see kind of a little bit of the process, once it goes through its oxidation in the kiln, it will turn into this terracotta color. So again, they're not exactly the same color, but that's just going in the kiln. Same thing if you're using a white clay. It looks more gray, but then once it goes into the kiln or once it air dries all the way and all the moisture is out of it, it will be almost that like pearly bone white. Okay, so this again is an example of black figure. We are playing a little bit with overlap and we're seeing some of that here, just with positive negative space and contour lines. Red figure again, it's just very similar. It's just flip-flopping those colors and where you're adding the black. And white ground, this one is a little bit more, this would be a little more expensive for ancient Greek pottery. You're adding one more element, one more color, but with that, you're able to kind of add another piece to your design. So you have black, red, and white now. And so it's just one of those things where now you can do like foreground, middle ground, background, things like that. So it is a little bit more advanced. You're seeing a little bit more technique and skill. And so that's why it would be a little more expensive. I want to, hopefully this will play, but I want to show you guys this video. Let's see. Make sure.
Greek vases were made of terracotta or baked clay. Before the clay could be used for pottery, pebbles and other impurities had to be removed. First, the potter mixed the raw clay with water in large outdoor pools to make a thick, silty liquid. This liquid clay stood until the heavier impurities had settled to the bottom. The refined liquid was then drained off into a second pool. The potter repeated this settling process several times. The pool was then left to evaporate in the sun, leaving behind the refined clay. The final step in preparing the clay for potting was called wedging. The potter systematically compressed and folded the clay, making it more malleable and mixing together any parts that may have settled into layers. The clay was now ready for use. Most Greek vases were thrown or formed on the potter's wheel. The complex shapes of Greek pottery often required that a vase be thrown in pieces and then assembled. For example, to make a kylix or cup, the potter first centered the clay on the wheel. When it stopped wobbling, the potter began a central hole. Pressure from the potter's fingers inside the hole gradually widened this opening and formed the bowl of the cup. Aside from the wheel, the potter's main tools were his hands, although a wet sponge was often used to smooth the surface. To make the foot of the cup, the potter again centered the clay, drew it up, and then hollowed out the stem. The next day, when the formed pieces had dried slightly, the bowl of the cup was trimmed with a metal shaver and received a final smoothing. The potter used wet clay to bond the separately made bowl and foot and then smoothed over the join. Next, the potter stretched out lengths of clay and bent them into handles. Again using wet clay, the potter attached the handles to the bowl, often roughening the joining surfaces to increase the bond. The vase was now ready to be decorated. Athenian vase painters experimented with a number of different methods of vase decoration. To create a vase in the black figure technique, that is, with black figures against a red background, the vase painter first sketched the outline of the design, in this case a dolphin, onto the surface of the vessel. Then, using a highly refined liquid clay as paint, the vase painter filled in the outline, creating a silhouette. When applied, the clay paint was almost the same color as the surface of the vase, but with firing, it would turn black. The vase painter next used a sharp point to scratch internal details through the silhouette. The vase was then ready for the kiln. The contrasting red and black color scheme of Athenian pottery was the result of a difficult three-stage firing process. Using wood-fired kilns or ovens, vases were heated to about 800 degrees centigrade in an oxygen-rich environment, causing the whole vase to turn red. Next, the potter closed off the vents of the kiln and added green wood and leafy branches, creating an oxygen-poor environment. As a result, the whole vase turned black. At the same time, the kiln temperature was raised, causing the thin, painted layer of decorative clay to become glossy and non-porous. Finally, the kiln was allowed to slowly cool, and the potter reopened the vents, letting oxygen into the kiln again. In this stage, the unpainted areas of the vessels returned to their warm red color, but the glossy areas, which could not absorb oxygen, remained black.
All right. So that was just like a little visual of what you would have seen and how they would do it in a time that's not like today, where we have some of those modern tools and things like that. So let's go back to our presentation. All right, so some of the things I want you guys to look at, and this is where I'm hoping that you'll get some of this inspiration. And again, I'll make this slide public so that you can go through and see this after this video is over. But here are some designs to inspire you. Now notice that some of them will be red figure, black figure, and white ground. But we can kind of judge them and categorize them into periods. So we're going to start with the geometric period. Here, we are not seeing as many scenes of history or storytelling or things like that. And it's just these interesting and intricate designs that are decorating the entire vase. You'll still see some of these geometric patterns in the other periods, but it's not going to be the bulk of the art. So, you know, like in this student's artwork, they did one of these Greek keys, and they did some geometric stuff there, but then they had their figure on the front. Again, something like this, where you're seeing like a pattern repetition on the top, stuff on the bottom, and seeing stuff like that. It's geometric, but it's not just geometric. But this is great for adding those things. All right, then you have the orientalizing phase, where we're seeing some inspiration from their trade with the like Asian countries, and you know, even some Egyptian. We're seeing some things like that, but just from the palm trees, the animals, still seeing some of those patterns, and like we saw in geometric, but we're now telling a little bit more stories. We're seeing some more, instead of just straight lines and curves, we're seeing some of these like palm branches and things like that. Then we have the archaic period, and now is when we are, you know, taking these patterns from the geometric and the orientalizing periods, but we're adding scenes, and here we even have 3 colors, scenes of Greek mythology, scenes of, you know, important people or political figures, emperors, all of those things, and they're being told on the vases, so that is getting more challenging. And then we have the classic period, which we're seeing a lot of white ground. So again, we're advancing that technology, but like that technique, and what we have and what we're making our art out of. So adding that white glaze or adjusting the kiln temperature so you're getting some of that white as well. Okay, so again, we have lots of scenes and stories, hopefully inspiring you. This is just a really famous pot. It goes through like an entire mythological story. And now we're looking at some of the shapes and why or how they were used in ancient Greece. These all range in different sizes and shapes, but notice where the handles are in some of them. Notice how wide the mouths are, or how small they are, if they've got a foot on the bottom, things like that. Because you guys are going to be creating, hopefully using one of these as inspiration, but then creating your own. But, you know, think about what you want yours to look like it's used for, okay? So we're just gonna kind of go through the different types, okay? Many of these are used for pouring. If you see a spout on it, like a pitcher, if it's got like that, you know, it's heavy, but then it can pour. So there's one handle on the side. If you have something that's really wide, maybe you have it for like fruits or something like that. Things like this can be used for ashes, and they might even tell a story about like the afterlife or what's happened, and like the mythology behind that when a person dies. Um, but you know, something smaller is for like a personal sized cup. These these are really small. So that's all that really intense detail. But even things as much as like perfumes or fine oils, they would be in much smaller containers or jars. Like this is one that's like this big. But again, like that would be something like where you contain oil or perfume. You also have things for like ashes. If you had a big container and didn't have handles, that would be something that would be like in the kitchen or in a storage that would have things for like cooking that you just need lots of, and to have it on hand all the time. This is also really important to know when we're talking about Greek art, but there are 3 different types of columns and they kind of specialized in this. But do try to remember the difference between Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. So your Doric, I like to say Doric, Boric, it's like the most boring out of them, or the most plain, just classic look. Ionic is one step up, and you've got these great kind of strong little finishes on the top. And then the Corinthian, just like its name, is a little bit extra fancy, and you have a little bit of extra detail, lots of those spirals, multi-layers of texture and things of that nature. Okay, so this is what we'd see it on a temple like that. Again, just strong, simple, classic. Here's your Ionic, same classic, but just with a little tiny bit of flair. And then the Corinthian, super fancy, above and beyond, over the top. All right. So what we're going to do for our project is we're going to create our own Greek vases. Now you guys will not be using a potter's wheel, but we will be doing it out of pinch pots. And I am going to be going through that step-by-step / day-by-day with you in this video as well. But now I am going to go over ceramics. If you need to take a little break, this would be the time. So just pause it. But if you are ready to go and you want to keep plugging, this is really important information, especially if you've never used ceramics before. If you are using air dry clay, it is a little bit different and a little bit different temperament than with our earthenware clays, but it still kind of have those same properties. Okay, so let's just get started. Things made from clay, the basic material for all ceramic creations. So that's what anything that's made of clay is a ceramic work. Clay is created as a result of the decomposition of igneous rock that make, igneous rock, which makes up the entire Earth's crust. Basically, we're working with 3 different variables: moisture, plasticity, and heat. All of the art, ceramics is perhaps the longest history, dating back to when people first learned how to control fire. Some theories are people first began to model clay as a diversion, and we saw some of this in our cave art, and people used clay for practical purposes. We still do. The clay that you work with in the studio has been processed and prepared for some degree. But early potters had to go and dig their raw materials from the ground and prepare it. We saw that in the video. There were some impurities that had to be taken out, like those rocks and things that are not going to be good in your pottery. All right, some properties that you should be aware of are plasticity, shrinkage, texture, moisture, and handling clay. Plasticity is probably one of the key elements of your clay. Most beginners, which that's what we are using very highly plastic clay, one that can easily take different shapes. Plastic, the property of clay that allows it to change shape without tearing or breaking, is how we're going to be starting our clay. And there are many factors that can make it more plastic, and then the opposite of that be less plastic. if you spray clay with water, or if you are working it with water on your hands, it becomes very plastic, almost muddy. Um, when you store it in a bag, it stays the same plastic. If you spray that bag down with water, or you put a wet paper towel in the bag with the clay, it will add moisture to it as well. You can also mix new plastic clay with older clay, and that would make it more plastic as well. Another principle is shrinkage, and we don't always think about this, but until after it's fired. So it's important to remember that all clay shrinks as it dries. So you have this really moist clay, very plastic, and then as it gets drier, there is a little bit of shrinkage. So if you have a top on your container, this fit perfectly before it was fired, and then after it lost a little bit of moisture, and then went into the kiln, it shrunk a little bit more. So it's not a perfect fit, but it still fits. So it's just really important that as you are letting your clay dry out, you're just checking it, watching it, making sure it's not cracking. If it's cracking, add a little bit of moisture, smooth it out, and then dry it slowly, or more slowly. It is really frustrating to spend a lot of time on creating your artwork only to have it crack because you did not take the time to allow it to dry slowly. One of the artworks that I did for one of my friends, the entire base cracked. I don't know if you can see that, but this cracked right before it. I was able to save it, but it was not easy. And it's just, you just have to really take your time, let it dry slowly, watch it, all that stuff. Clay is a very fickle friend. The next thing is texture. The texture of a clay body can range from coarse to smooth. We're right in the middle with the clay that we'll be using. Porcelain is a really, really smooth clay. And that's others like other hi-fi are really fine, like China, that's really smooth clay as well. Some potters add sand or grog to change the texture of clay. Grog is just if you take a piece of clay and you break it and smash it into little like little tiny dusts of fired clay, and then you kind of mix it in with some of your clay. That's grog. It just kind of makes it stronger. Moisture, all clay contains moisture. You can add water to clay to make it more workable or plastic. If you add too much water, it loses its plasticity. It won't hold, it will just turn into a giant puddle of mud. As clay begins to dehydrate, it will begin to dehydrate or lose its moisture when it is exposed to air or when it's exposed to your hands, because your hands will touch it and then the moisture will suck out of the clay and into your hands. So make sure you keep that in mind as well. So again, you will occasionally need to rehydrate it or put water back into it to keep it moist if you are working with it too long. We probably will not need to do that. You can mist it with a spray bottle or dampen it with a sponge, paper towel, your hands. But once the clay is fired, it becomes permanently harder, stronger, and less likely to break. It can never become plastic after it's fired. If it's leather hard or bone dry, it takes a long time, but you can work it back to being plastic eventually. But once it's fired, that is it. It is like that permanently. Okay, so now we're going to get started with the clay. When you are preparing the clay, and before you use it, you need to prepare it. All clay needs to be de-aired before you begin. We don't want any little air bubbles, so kneading it or wedging it eliminates air bubbles and keeps the internal structure of the clay more cohesive and consistent. Some people use canvas to absorb extra moisture. If you have that, you can, but you can also just use like a plain table. Make sure your surface is clean, but really just kneading it in your hand will work as well, since we're using such a small amount. Just a couple safety things before we get started. Little bits of clay that end up on the surface of your table are harmless. However, if they're brushed onto the floor, they break down into smaller particles and then scatter into the air when you breathe. So don't just brush it off to the floor. Get a paper towel or a sponge that's wet and clean down your clay from your surface. Okay, you don't want to sweep it or You know, brush it so that it crumbles up and falls under your feet and ends up getting back into the air. Just take care of it with some water. Sorry, I'm getting my computer charged. And a sponge. Okay, so that way there's no clay dust. I mean, there are some conditions, and really just with what we're doing, it's not going to hurt you anyway. It's mostly for if you own a studio or you are a potter professionally and you do it over time, you can get something that's called potter's lawn. All right. So when you are working with leather hard clay, you are going to be using something called slip. Slip is basically just clay that's watered down. It has a consistency of like a very liquid yogurt. Basically, if you have little scraps of clay, throw it in a jar, save it for slip. It's just, and then just shake it up and or crush it up. When it becomes bone dry, add water, mix it up, you get slip. I like to whip my slip. So I have an electric mixer in the art room and you just stir it around with the water and it gets that good consistency. Slip is basically just clay glue. All right, this is something that you will need to know forever and ever and ever and ever. These are the 5 stages of clay. Starts with plastic clay, then it goes to leather hard, then it becomes bone dry, or at that point it is greenware. Once it's bone dry and all the moisture is out, you can put it in the kiln. After it's been fired once, it is bisqueware. This project, we are stopping at bisqueware, okay? In other artworks, or if you're in the room and you want to glaze it, so after it's come out and it, you know, is this matted color, you can add glaze to it, put it back in the kiln, and then it becomes glazeware. So those are the 5 stages of clay. And we're gonna go over them a little bit in depth. Plastic clay is very pliable and plastic. It is smushy and it can be modeled and it, you know, gets all over their hands, things like that. It's very forgiving, I think, in this state. You can model things, you can move it around. It's very workable. It's perfect for throwing, making coils, even starting slabs. It can be reclaimed at this stage. And reclaimed just means that you add water to it and it's back to its original state. Leather hard clay, and this is all, again, what that plastic is kind of dried out to become. Leather hard clay is a little bit stiffer. It's kind of like a chocolate bar, but a little bit more bendy. And pots are incised and trimmed at this stage, or anything, any of your ceramics is when you would want to like make your kind of finishing touches, fine tuning things. You can put things together this way. It is still cool to touch. It's a little bit lighter, but it's not as wet as plastic. And even if you add water to it, it can go back to plastic. It still can be reclaimed. Then you have our bone dry clay. It's very chalky looking. It's not nearly as cool to the touch because the moisture has come out of it. It is very, very, very fragile at this stage. I give lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of warnings to all of my students, and every single semester, someone's clay, more than one person usually, it breaks at bone dry because they were not being super, 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 super careful. I'm not even kidding. If you set it down the wrong way, pieces will fall off. Okay, this is the most fragile your clay will be. Some of you who are using the clay from school will have to carefully get it back to the school and make an appointment with me so that I can take it and put it directly into the kiln so it's not laying around the commons and stuff like that. So it's very scary to transport bone dry clay, but it's just something that you're gonna have to do. But it's very, 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 very fragile. Do not try to work with clay at this stage. Taking a brush, like a paintbrush, and putting some water on it to smooth something out, you can do that, but that's besides that. Don't try to scrape anything off or adjust anything. It will just flake off. All right, after your first firing, it becomes bisqueware. This is a kiln. A kiln is just a clay oven. It gets up to like 2,000 degrees, very, very, very hot. And we've got one in the art room. But it's going to be much more brittle. It's white. Once it has been fired, you can't add water to it, and it comes back to like that plastic clay. It will be like this forever until you break it. And then adding glaze to it and putting back in the kiln, it'll just make it even stronger. It's how you can add color and all that stuff. It's a glassy finish, and that is like the final stage. It's glazeware. All right, so when you are ready, again, take a little break. That's a lot of information. Thank you for listening. Now what you're going to do is get ready for your clay. And again, we're going to space it out and structure it one day at a time. So today, what I would really like for you to do is to sketch the vase that you think you're going to make and complete your clay egg or your pinch pot chamber. And that's going to be it for today. And then we're going to pick it back up for tomorrow. But in your sketchbook, the first thing you're going to do is sketch out a design for your vase. I only want you to do like 2 designs of what it will actually look like. Include handles, include any kinds of like bases or foots and things like that. If it has a neck or like a topper on it, include all of those things. And then even start now, you don't have to, but if you want to start coming up with a couple designs for yours, or like if you're really into Greek mythology, maybe like you have a mythology thing that you want to include there. Okay, so for me, there's my, I was showing blending, so I didn't want to waste paper, but here is the base that I'm thinking I'm wanting to make. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to start by making this little chamber here. Everything else is going to be added on later. But this is what we're going to do out of a pinch pot. So this part right here. All right. So, oops, there goes my paintbrushes. When you're coming up with your design, before you touch your clay, these are the things I want you to consider, okay? So again, we have difficulty, focus, craftsmanship, composition, creativity, principles of design. But you need to think about the following, okay? Your structure as a whole. It has to have at least 2 handles, neck, lid, base, okay? So if you have 2 handles on yours, you get the full 10 points. If you have a base and a neck on yours, okay, and again, I'm gonna label this real quick. Handle. Okay, so this is all that I've included. I have a neck, I have 2 handles, and I have a base. So that is way more than I need. Any extra thing you add on will be 5 points of extra credit. Now, while you're considering all of these things, I would just make a lid for a just in case. So if you have just 2 handles and they both break off in bone dry, you're going to get 0 points for this, even though I know that you tried and you worked really hard. So I would over prepare, and then maybe you'll get extra credit and be pleasantly surprised. This one, for example, I have 2 handles, a neck, and a base. If I have all of those things, I would get 10 extra credit points. All right. If one of those things break off, I get 5 extra credit points. If 2 of those things break off, and I'm talking mostly about the handles, they're probably the most delicate and fragile. But if I have 2 handles break off, then I still have 10 points. All right. The next thing is that it's smooth, it doesn't have any cracks, and it's a consistent thickness. This one, for example, like this is really, really smooth. There are no cracks in it. I think this one is even smoother, but hold on a second, let me see if I can find. Oh, this one lost a couple points because I don't know if you can see down here, that's glue. The whole base broke off and they had to glue it back together. So just make sure there's no cracks, that it's nice and consistently thick. Make sure the shape is balanced. We'll talk about this when our art is leather hard, and we can do a little bit of shaping that way. Like if you look at it from here, that looks really balanced. It's really strong. That was a really, really good one. Here again, everything is nice and balanced. It's not like super like curvy on one side and then super like flat on the other. It's just got a really good overall balance, symmetrical from all angles. And then the last thing you're judged on is your design, attention to detail. Did you have Greek influence? Okay, so that's how it's going to be graded for your project. So this was the end of our presentation. The first thing I want you to do is do your sketch. The second thing I want you to do today is to make your first step, that little chamber or that little clay egg air bubble. All right, then follow the video and then we'll deal with the next thing tomorrow. So thanks very much. Excited about clay and what we're going to be doing with it. So good work. Have a good day.